Hello and welcome to another week of Cultural Theory at the Movies. I hope you all had a restful weekend and hope you had a chance to catch your breath before we begin a relatively grueling part of the May term, the second week. I sent an email announcement about a change in schedule. My hope is that not only will that be particularly helpful for preparing you all for the writing assignment you'll be doing next weekend, to have that day on Thursday where you're going to revise and resubmit some of your PM's work from previous days. But I also hope that it gives us just a little bit of respite from the otherwise hectic pace of always having to meet on the discussion boards and all that. So I'll go over that again later this week in an email. But in the meantime, let me dive into the material for today. Both Nancy Fraser and Michael Denning are, as you probably can tell from these readings, both Marxist theorists. And I want to make it very clear where they're coming from and sort of the larger context or background in which they're writing. Both of them are contemporary Marxist theorists, which is to say that while they are very keen and able to perform Marxist critiques of capitalism and looking out at how to politically organize in response to or in opposition to capitalism, they both have very important correctives that they want to add. So they're sort of standing on the shoulder of the giant of Marx, but not willing to just stay there. They want to extend or expand some of his arguments in two very specific ways, which we'll talk about. So I just think that's really important. And as such, I think it's really important to also recognize that neither of them is launching a sort of more moral or ethical critique about capitalism. As Marxists, they are looking at the system in which we live, the political economy specifically, and they are asking very almost scientific kinds of questions. Like they are looking at some basic contradictions or fundamental flaws in that system, and I guess like an engineer would, they're pointing those out. They're doing some quality management and arguing that in fact we need to redo the system because there are some basic fundamental issues and crises within the system that we currently live in. So I just want to make that clear too, that this is less about making an ethical or moral sort of critique of greed or the wealthy or what have you, and more of a systemic analysis of the world we live in, and particularly, again, the political economy of capitalism. So let me dive into the actual heart of the matter. With Nancy Fraser, as you probably know from reading the piece, social reproduction is really what she is talking about in this excerpt. And she is in particular pointing out that social reproduction is something that capitalism is absolutely reliant upon, and yet, because of its drive, the drive within the capitalist system for ceaseless and unending profit, there is a way that, in fact, capitalism is always undermining that on which it is dependent upon, which is social reproduction. And what she says there on page 99, the first page of the reading, is that we tend to look at capitalism and always analyze it from the economic standpoint, but as she points out towards the bottom of the page, that the social reproduction strand forms an important dimension of the crisis within capitalism, even though it's neglected very often. So she really wants to, if nothing else, highlight that social reproductive dimension as crucial. Moving on to page 100, she lays out very clearly here in the middle of the page on 100 that particular contradiction that she's focusing on. On the one hand, social reproduction is a condition of possibility. Let me unpack that phrase. That is to say that social reproduction, for capitalism to be possible, social reproduction is one of the necessary conditions for the possibility of capitalism. As she points out elsewhere, Capitalism would not be able to exist without the need to constantly reproduce, both on the biological level, like actual like future laborers, but also on the social level. Like there needs to be a society which social reproduction produces or reproduces in order for capitalism to operate. To use a very problematic but nevertheless helpful, I guess, metaphor, a virus needs a living, active host, a body, in order to survive. It cannot survive really on its own, and so capitalism has that same necessity for a society in which it basically operates. And so it's a condition of possibility for sustained capital accumulation. But on the other hand, capitalism's orientation to unlimited accumulation, again, this drive within capitalism that's not about greed, although greed is one of the ideological, political, ethical dimensions of capitalism, but capitalism as a system has an orientation to unlimited accumulation, and it's that orientation that ultimately destabilizes the very fabric of social reproduction on which it relies. So there you have, in a very kind of crystallized form, her contradiction of capital and care. But let's keep going. She mentions, I believe, elsewhere on 100 or at the top of 101, I believe it is. Actually, it's the middle of 101. This is a very important point, that it's not just social reproduction that has this sort of weird contradictory space or place within capitalism. There's also the same thing with democracy, what she calls governance functions performed by public powers, but also on the availability of nature, sort of the environment. Those are also two of the same kinds of contradictory relationships within capitalism. Capitalism requires, to some degree, a democratic political process to thrive, and yet, as we know all too well, capitalism often undermines democracy by, for instance, allowing for moneyed interests to essentially take over the governance functions and do as they please without the ability for the working class to really have a say. In the same way with the environment, capitalism obviously needs natural resources to operate, and yet capitalism is constantly undermining, if not completely just destroying, the environment upon which it depends. So, wanted to mention that with regard to page 101. I think these are just different ways that she mentions this same contradiction that I've been referring to. I will say that there are some really nice passages, including on 101, where she talks about what it is, what social reproduction actually is. She calls it, it's variously called care, affective labor, subjectivation, etc. What it really is activity, as she says, that forms capitalism's human subjects, sustaining them as embodied natural beings. So in other words, taking care of their most basic biological needs, like the laborer has to eat, has to sleep, etc., and somebody has to help make that happen, but also social reproduction constitutes these subjects as social beings, forming their, for example, cultural and other forms of interpersonal relationships. Again, think about this not only as the reproduction of the biological side of people, but also the social side of it, the need to maintain and sustain social relationships that will keep a society, I guess, afloat in some ways. And then again, in 102, we sort of get at the very top another succinct phrasing that non-waged social reproductive activity is necessary to the existence of waged work and the accumulation of surplus value and the functioning of capitalism as such, and yet it is that which is undermined by capitalism itself. Moving on into 103, she says, and I think this is important, that capitalist economic production is not self-sustaining, right? That it cannot, and I guess this is just another way of saying what I've already said many times, but it is not able to sustain itself. It requires social reproduction, and yet it is going to destabilize that social reproduction. And as she says there in the middle of 103, as we can see, the effect of this contradiction is that ultimately we have a jeopardizing of the necessary social conditions of the capitalist economy. And she brings up at the very end there on 103 this metaphor or image, if you will, of capital's accumulation dynamic effectively eating its own tail, right? This notion of it being something that is self-defeating, really, ultimately. Let's move on to Denning. I want to just mention that in Denning, it's really important to recognize here again that he's not just saying that, oh, the problem is we don't pay enough attention to, in sort of a moral sense, those who do not have jobs, the unemployed or the wageless. That is not, I think, what Denning is really getting at. What he's ultimately trying to say is that capitalism as a system starts from the standpoint of people who are wageless and their need, their absolute imperative, their mandate to find waged labor. That is the crucial moment in capitalism's genesis, in its birth, is that people are required as people who have been left displaced without any other means of subsistence, etc. They are then forced to make that decision, if you will, although it's not really a decision, it's a mandate to go and find waged labor, and he thinks that's a very important dynamic. So let's go through it as I've done before with other readings, page by page. He starts with this really fascinating catch-22 is really what it is, that in capitalism, the only thing worse than being exploited as a wage laborer, as a worker, is to actually not be a wage laborer, to be in some ways not exploited. That's the only thing worse, and because ultimately then you really have no means of survival. And so there is this really strange catch-22 that all of us have sort of, I guess in some ways, learned to live with, but it's a really, really problematic one if you think about it. And he says there very, very clearly what it is that forces the wageless person to seek out a wage, which is that the wageless person is dispossessed of land, tools, and the means of subsistence. That's really important. That what makes somebody, what forces somebody, in other words, to enter into the wage labor force is really not a choice or a sense of enterprise or whatever, but because they are left with nothing else that would allow them to survive on their own. And so he says, towards the bottom there of page 79, understandings built upon wage labor cannot account for the reality lived by the most numerous and wretched of the world's population. And this is important, that in fact those without wages, those who are forced to find all sorts of informal and sort of indirect ways of surviving, are actually the most numerous of the world's population, even though we tend to think of most of the world as being employed in wage labor kinds of situations. In fact, most of the world is kind of trying to just barely make ends meet in whatever way, shape, or form, including very informal, indirect ways of doing so. And so he ends with this image on that paragraph on 79, that it's not the child in the sweatshop we should be thinking about as the most characteristic element of capitalism, but in fact the child in the streets, the one who doesn't even have that kind of wage labor contract to fall back on. On page 80 at the very bottom, again, this is important because it helps us understand Denning's systematic critique, not the moral critique, but systematic. Capitalism begins not with the offer of work, but with the imperative to earn a living. I think that's a really important sentence, because, again, it's not that capitalism starts because there's this benevolent capitalist. I'm thinking of the image of the box on Monopoly, the game Monopoly, the one with the top hat, Moneybags. It's not that Moneybags comes and offers work. That's not where capitalism starts. Capitalism starts because people have been dispossessed of land, tools, and the means of subsistence, and therefore are forced to have to earn a living, and of course they then have to turn to moneybags in order to get the wage they need to survive. Dispossession, this is back on 80 at the bottom. Dispossession and expropriation, right? The dispossessing of people of their land and tools and means of subsistence, and expropriation, which is literally not just to dispossess that stuff, but the capitalist takes those things over, followed by the enforcement of money, taxes, and rent. This is what we call free labor. This is the free labor market that we often hear talked about. And Denning is obviously pointing out how not free that is. And then we get to the middle of 81, which is, I think, that last paragraph of the entire excerpt is really where he crystallizes his argument. Rather than seeing the breadwinning factory worker as the productive base on which our entire society is based upon, imagine the dispossessed household as a wageless base of subsistence labor. People just literally trying to survive. Forget about wages and income and wealth and all that. Just literally people bare bones trying to make ends meet, even though they don't have the tools to do that. And that is what we should be focusing on as the centerpiece of capitalism. And then at the very bottom of that paragraph on 81, unemployment precedes employment. And the informal economy precedes the formal, both historically and conceptually. Again, he's thinking about this as if he was reading a blueprint of the capitalist political economy, and he's saying, look, in this blueprint, you can see that, in fact, unemployment and informal work is what actually precedes what we typically champion as the centerpiece of capitalism, which is the employed and the wage laborer. Wageless life, not wage labor, is the starting point in understanding the free market, again, in sort of scare quotes, if you will, because it's not necessarily very free. So those are some of the principles that are important to the reading, and I will stop there because I'm out of time, but we will talk about Parasite on the discussion board through and through, so I look forward to talking about it with you there.